Welcome to another deep dive. I think a lot of us are looking for that sweet spot where we can really get a grasp on some pretty complex ideas. And, without getting lost in a maze of, well, complexities.
I hear you, yeah. Some of these philosophical systems can feel like you're wandering through a labyrinth. And I think that's especially true when we're dealing with, well, with figures like Roderick Chisholm.
Chisholm.
He's someone who really, really built this comprehensive philosophical system.
Yeah.
You really see it spanning epistemology, metaphysics, ethics. When I think about Chisholm, I kind of get reminded of, like, Leibniz or Descartes. Right? These big system
These
builders.
are big thinkers, yeah.
Yeah, really trying to cover kind of the whole waterfront philosophically. And what's fascinating to me, he was incredibly prolific, over 320 publications.
320, wow.
Yeah, and he was always revising and refining his positions. So there's a real kind of commitment to the ongoing process of philosophical inquiry that I think is really worth exploring.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, we're not going to get to everything, Chisholm, right?
No, of course not.
This is going to be kind of like a kind of guided tour.
Exactly.
Of some of the really core elements of Chisholm's thought. We're not going to get lost in all of the nuance of what his final views were or secondary literature. We really just want to try to get at, like, what's really characteristic of his philosophical architecture.
Right, and I think regardless of how much you've already thought about these different areas of philosophy, there's something really rewarding about studying Chisholm.
Yeah, I think so too.
Because there's this rigor and interconnectedness to his work that I think any philosopher can really appreciate.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start, right? So our mission, if you will, is to try to get to grips with those key aspects of Chisholm's work that are really going to help us understand kind of how his mind works as a philosopher and his enduring influence on the field. So I guess let's start with how he went about doing philosophy. Like, what was his characteristic approach, his method?
Yeah. So one thing that's really striking when you approach Chisholm is just how deliberate and structured his methodology is.
Structured, okay.
Yeah, so he really would typically start by trying to pinpoint, like, the key philosophical question. And he often would look to, kind of the classic Aristotelian puzzles, these aporia, as a kind of initial data set.
The things that don't seem to fit together quite right.
Yeah, the problems that any adequate philosophical theory would need to be able to address and resolve.
Okay.
And then his way of trying to address those problems was to construct theories in this really systematic way.
Systematic.
Yeah, so he would introduce kind of a small set of primitive or unanalyzed terms. These are going to be the foundational concepts for his whole system. And from these, he would build up these really elaborate networks of definitions and principles. And it's this sort of hierarchical, almost axiomatic structure that's really characteristic of his work.
It kind of reminds me, like, how you would develop a formal system in logic, right? You have axioms, and then you're building theorems from them.
Yeah, that's a really good comparison. And, this results often in a system of remarkable clarity and elegance. The logical architecture is just laid bare.
Okay.
But, of course, this is, as is often the case with these sorts of foundational systems, some critics would sometimes push back against the justification or even the clarity of those initial primitive concepts.
Yeah. If you're starting from something uncertain, then, the whole structure seems like it could be vulnerable.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, Chisholm himself was very much in favor of scrutiny. He actually really encouraged criticism.
He was open to being challenged.
Yeah, and especially through the use of counterexamples and objections. And it's funny, he really seemed to enjoy revising his views in response to well-reasoned challenges. He would talk about how he really enjoyed having students who would eagerly try to refute his arguments.
I love that idea, like a philosopher who's seeking out refutations, who's excited about people poking holes in their arguments.
Yeah, and I think for him, philosophical progress really hinged on this kind of rigorous engagement and refinement.
And this kind of back and forth, this iterative process, it became so associated with Chisholm's work, right?
Yes.
It even earned a spot in the philosophical lexicon.
Yeah, so there's this verb now, to chisholm.
To chisholm.
Which means to make repeated small alterations in a definition or example. And I just love that because it really captures this meticulous, constantly evolving way that he would go about philosophical formulation. He would propose a definition, someone would raise a counterexample, and he would chisel away at it,
Yeah.
either refining it to meet the objection or, in some cases, even completely reconsidering the initial definition.
Okay, so we've got this method that's grounded in these fundamental primitives.
Right.
This systematic logical construction.
Yes.
And this real pursuit of precision through revision.
Yeah.
Okay. Now let's turn to one of the central areas that he explored in his work, epistemology, the theory of knowledge. So what was Chisholm's take on how we know what we know?
Yeah. So Chisholm was very much a foundationalist in his epistemology. But his starting point wasn't really to engage in kind of wholesale skepticism. He didn't start by saying, well, we can't know anything. He really took it as given that we do have knowledge of the external world. Our memories generally give us knowledge of the past. We have a priori knowledge of certain necessary truths. And so his philosophical project was really to articulate how such knowledge is possible, to try to build this positive theory of knowledge.
Okay, so he's not trying to dismantle the edifice of knowledge. He's trying to build a framework for justified belief.
Exactly. And one of the key ways that he tries to do that is by developing this set of tightly linked epistemic principles.
Epistemic principle.
Yeah, these principles are meant to illuminate the logical relations between what he took to be kind of our directly evident foundational knowledge, the things we just know immediately without any sort of inference, and our kind of more indirect beliefs about the world and our past experiences. And we see these principles being developed throughout his career, first in his dissertation and then in the different editions of his really influential work, Theory of Knowledge.
And what are these principles built upon? Like, what's the core concept?
Well, what's really, I think, interesting for a philosopher is Chisholm's trying to build his whole epistemic system on a single primitive epistemic concept, and that is greater reasonability.
Okay.
So the core idea here is that for any subject at any time, holding one propositional attitude, so believing, disbelieving, or withholding judgment towards some proposition, that holding that attitude can be more or less reasonable than holding some other attitude towards a different proposition.
Okay.
So this is the core concept, this comparative notion of greater reasonability. That's what he's building his whole epistemology on.
Okay. So it's not about certainty and isolation. It's about kind of comparatively assessing belief states.
Exactly.
So how did he use this primitive concept of greater reasonability to define other key epistemic terms?
Right. So he built this whole hierarchy of epistemic appraisal based on this foundation.
Right.
So, for instance, in the first edition of Theory of Knowledge, he defines a proposition as reasonable if believing it is more reasonable than withholding it.
Yeah. Okay.
He defines a proposition as acceptable if withholding it is not more reasonable than believing it. And then finally, he defines a proposition as evident if it's reasonable and there's no other proposition that's more reasonable to believe.
Okay. So evident is like the top epistemic status in this framework.
Exactly. And Chisholm argues that a necessary condition for knowing some proposition is that it must be evident for the knower. And in his early work, he even analyzes knowledge as essentially evident true belief. But as any philosopher will know who's familiar with the Gettier problem, later on he has to modify this analysis to take into account those cases where you can have a justified true belief that doesn't seem to be knowledge because of luck.
Yeah, those counterexamples that keep epistemologists up at night. So how did these definitions then translate into his specific epistemic principles?
Yeah, so he lays out a number of principles that are supposed to help us get from kind of our foundational knowledge to this broader set of beliefs that we have.
Okay.
So one example would be Principle A, which has to do with what he calls self-presenting states. So these would be things like your current beliefs or hopes or feelings or your immediate sensory experiences. And Principle A says that if you are in a self-presenting state, then it is evident to you that you are in that state. So that's going to be kind of the bedrock for knowledge of our own mind.
That's our introspective knowledge.
Yeah, exactly. And then he has other principles like Principle B. So Principle B says that if you believe that you perceive something to have a certain property, then it's reasonable for you to believe that you do perceive it and that something has that property.
Okay.
So notice that this is the epistemic status here is just reasonable, not evident.
Okay, so if I believe that I see a book on the table, that doesn't automatically make it evident that there is a book on the table.
Yeah, that's right. Um, and then principle C, initially Chisholm said that if you believe that you perceive something with some sensible characteristic, then it is evident to you that you are perceiving it and that something has that characteristic. But Chisholm himself recognized that that there are problems with this sort of strong claim.
Especially when you start thinking about, context, like someone could be hallucinating, right?
Exactly. So he revises this principle. We get principle C prime, which introduces this really important notion of prima facie evidence.
Prima facie.
So this is evidence that is sufficient to warrant belief in the absence of any defeating evidence.
Okay.
Right. So this prima facie evidence that you might have from your perception can be overridden by the wider context. So, for example, if you're hallucinating, you have this background knowledge that you've taken a certain drug or something like that, which is going to defeat the prima facie evidence you have from your sensory experience.
Okay, so that's more nuanced. So what about our knowledge of the past? How do his principles address memory?
Right. So to deal with memory, he has these principles, D, E, and F. And what these principles basically do is they raise beliefs about the past to the level of acceptability or reasonability, but importantly, not to the level of evidence.
Okay.
So according to Chisholm, while memory gives us good grounds for believing things about what has happened, it doesn't have the same sort of fundamental epistemic weight as, for example, a currently experienced self-presenting state.
Okay, so memory can give us justification for believing in past events, but it doesn't provide the kind of certainty he associates with evidence. Is that right?
So that's right. And then he has other principles like principle G, which has to do with empirical acceptability and confirmation. So this principle says that if a hypothesis is supported by the set of all acceptable propositions, then that hypothesis itself becomes acceptable. And then principle H introduces this interesting kind of coherentist element into his overall kind of foundationalist picture.
Okay.
So this principle says that if a proposition is part of what he calls a concurrent set of acceptable propositions, so that's a logically consistent and mutually supporting set of propositions, if a proposition is part of a concurrent set, then it becomes reasonable.
Okay, so you have this network of beliefs. They're all lending support to each other. They can attain a higher epistemic status.
That's right. And then finally, principle I is meant to connect perception and these concurrent acceptable propositions and evident belief about the external world. So this is where that classic example of perceiving a doorknob comes into play. So if you believe that you see a doorknob and that belief coheres with with this broader set of acceptable beliefs that you have about the world that are arising from your other sensory experiences and so on, then according to principle I, it can actually become evident to you that there is a doorknob there.
Okay, so I see the interconnectedness here, right? He starts with the seemingly basic, and builds up to our understanding of the world.
Right.
But I think, as you mentioned, even Chisholm himself recognized that this was kind of a sketch, a framework that needed further development. It doesn't fully address every aspect of knowledge, like the nature of knowledge of the past in full detail.
Yeah, that's right. But I think it really does illustrate the core structure of his epistemological thought, which is this principle-based approach to trying to bridge the gap between this fundamental certainty that we have about our own minds and then this vast scope of our everyday knowledge claims.
Yeah. And as you pointed out, these principles are presented as fundamental epistemological facts. They're not derived from some other domain like logic or causality or even the reliability of our cognitive faculties.
Yeah.
These are within the system, the basic rules governing epistemic justification.
Yeah.
Okay. So another area that I think is really thought-provoking in Chisholm's epistemology is his treatment of what's known as the problem of the criterion.
Yeah, this is one of those foundational puzzles for epistemology.
Right. So for our listener who's a philosopher, this is a key issue.
Yeah. So the problem of the criterion is this.
Yeah.
To know what constitutes knowledge, don't we first need some criterion, some rule for distinguishing cases of knowledge from mere belief?
Mm.
But then to determine the validity of that criterion, don't we need some examples of things that we already know? So it seems like there's this really vicious circularity here.
Yeah, it's like which comes first, right? Like the criterion or the instances of knowledge.
Right. So it's a real chicken and egg situation for
It's
knowledge.
classic epistemological dilemma.
Yeah. And Chisholm famously distinguished between what he called Methodists, who think that we must possess a criterion for knowledge before we can identify any instances of it, and then particularists who think that we start with particular examples of things that we know, and from those examples we derive our criterion. And Chisholm was very firmly in the particularist camp, and he famously argued that the way to resolve this seemingly intractable problem is by what he called begging the question in favor of our common sense beliefs, the things that we intuitively just take ourselves to know.
So essentially his stance is, well, we do know some things.
Yeah.
And that's where we start to figure out what knowledge is.
Yeah. And he thought that any attempt to establish a criterion for knowledge prior to having kind of any instances of knowledge is just going to lead to skepticism.
Okay, so you start with our everyday kind of convictions about what we know.
Yeah.
And those provide like the most reasonable foundation for epistemological inquiry.
Yeah, that's right. And this really connects directly to his epistemological internalism, which is this view that that justification is something that's accessible to you just through introspection.
Just by looking within.
Yeah. Chisholm was a very strong defender of internalism. And he thought that just by reflecting on your own conscious states, what he famously called from the armchair, you can formulate epistemic principles. You can determine whether your beliefs are justified. You don't need to look outside of your own mind to external factors like the causal history of your beliefs or the reliability of your cognitive processes to see whether you're justified in holding some belief.
Okay. So if two individuals have like completely indistinguishable conscious states, they must necessarily have the same justified beliefs.
Right.
Irrespective of any differences in their external circumstances or even like the actual truth of those beliefs.
That's right.
Okay, so this is a robust internalist foundation for knowledge.
Yeah.
That's built upon this concept of greater reasonability.
Yeah.
And this carefully constructed system of principles. Okay, now let's shift gears a little bit. Let's move into another really significant area of Chisholm's work, metaphysics. And in particular, I want to focus on his enduring investigation into the nature of persons. This seems to be like a really central and long-standing concern in his philosophical development.
He really is. Yeah, it's this it's a recurring theme throughout his work, and it culminates in his influential book Person and Object. And his approach here, as in epistemology, begins with what he calls pre-analytic data.
Pre-analytic data.
Yeah. So these are the things that we intuitively just believe to be true about persons. And he thinks that any adequate metaphysical theory of persons should accommodate these beliefs, or at least give us some compelling reason to reject them. He treats these beliefs as kind of innocent until proven guilty. Right. So what kind of pre-analytic data does he have in mind? Well, it's things like persons are genuine objects in the world. They're not just abstract concepts or convenient fictions. We're beings who possess beliefs, feelings, and desires. We're embodied. We have a physical body. We engage in intentional action. And these are all attributes that have characterized us not just in the present, but in the past as well. And he also places a lot of emphasis on this fact of what he calls the unity of consciousness.
The unity of consciousness.
Yeah, the seeming undeniable fact that all of these diverse simultaneous psychological states that we have, they all belong to a single unified subjective experience.
Right. It all comes together in one consciousness.
Yeah. So the working assumption here is that there is a single entity, a single thing that's the bearer of all these diverse attributes.
Right. So this immediately brings to mind, the contrast with the bundle theory of persons.
Yes.
Famously associated with David Hume.
Right.
So the bundle theory says there's no enduring self, no like owner of experiences, just a constantly changing collection of perceptions or bundle of perceptions.
That's right. And Chisholm offers this really, I think, sharp criticism of the bundle theory. So he points out that even even Hume's argument against a unified self seems to presuppose that there is some perceiver. There's this he that's doing the introspecting and noticing the supposed absence of persistent self. And Chisholm's point is, well, who or what is this he, if not a unified subject of experience?
Yeah, that's a very, very economical and I think effective objection. So what about materialism, the view that, a person is ultimately identical to their physical body? Chisholm, it seems, had some real reservations about materialism.
He did, yeah. He was very critical of materialism, and one of his key objections stems from this fundamental metaphysical distinction that he draws between things that exist in their own right. So these are things that he calls ennetia per se, and then things that exist in virtue of other things. So these are ennetia per alio. And to really make this distinction vivid, he appeals to the classic ship of Theseus thought experiment. So as you know, the planks of the original ship are gradually replaced over time until eventually you have a ship that's composed entirely of new parts.
Right.
And the question is it the same ship?
Right. And this is getting at the puzzle of identity through change.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So Chisholm's thought is that the identity of the ship of Theseus through this process of gradual replacement is what he calls loose and popular, but not strict and philosophical.
Okay.
So in the strict philosophical sense, identity demands having exactly the same constituent parts. So if we were to say that we are strictly identical to our bodies at any given moment, given that our bodies are constantly undergoing change, cells are dying and being replaced, then it would follow that our personal identity over time is also merely loose and popular.
Okay, so there's no strict persistence through change.
That's right. And Chisholm finds this really counterintuitive. I mean, we have this very strong subjective sense that we are the same person that we were, years ago, despite the obvious physical changes that our bodies have undergone.
Yeah.
So this leads him to bring up this other really interesting thought experiment, which is due to Charles Sanders Peirce. And it's the thought experiment of having surgery performed without anesthesia, but with induced amnesia.
Okay.
So the idea is, even if other people were to stipulate for conventional purposes that the individual on the operating table is not you. Chisholm's thought is that we still have this fundamental kind of unease about this. We think, but won't that person still be me? And this suggests that our persistence is not just a matter of social convention.
It's deeper than that.
Yeah, it's something more fundamental. And so Chisholm argues that that materialism, by making us entia per alio, by making us dependent for identity on this particular configuration of matter, that it contradicts this deep self-perception that we have of ourselves as entia per se, as existing in our own right.
As having this inherent intrinsic identity.
That's right.
Okay. He also develops a modal argument against materialism.
He does, yeah.
Based on this principle of mereological essentialism.
Yes.
Which is the idea that a composite object can't survive the loss of any of its original essential parts.
That's right. So Chisholm points out that it's possible for him to survive the loss of, say, his hand.
Right.
Right. So there is a possible world in which Roderick Chisholm exists without his left hand. However, his body, conceived as this specific collection of physical parts that it currently possesses, it couldn't undergo the loss of his hand and remain numerically the same collection of parts.
Okay.
And so since Chisholm has a property that his body lacks, namely the possibility of existing without that particular hand, they can't be identical.
Right.
Right. So this is a straightforward application of Leibniz's law.
Okay. So the ability for us to conceive of ourselves persisting through the loss of bodily parts suggests that there's this fundamental distinction between ourselves and our physical bodies as mereological wholes.
Exactly. And he also argues that, we don't just borrow mental properties like hoping for rain from some temporary bodily substrate.
Right.
Rather, we fundamentally possess these properties. And again, this supports the idea that we are enantia per se.
Right, that we have this inherent independent existence.
Right.
Okay, so this seems to naturally lead to the consideration of persons as simple non-composite entities.
It does, yeah. He considers whether persons might be simple bodily substances. No. But he ultimately defines a bodily substance as something that has parts. Okay. And so that rules out that option. Okay. And this leaves open the possibility that persons are fundamentally simple, immaterial substances. Okay. Which is, reminiscent of the monads of Leibniz
Like a soul in a more traditional philosophical
Yeah,
terminology.
something akin to that. And in fact, his argument from his paper on the simplicity of the soul is that, well, we know of our qualitative properties. So these are internal states that could characterize a simple isolated entity. So things like hoping for rain. Um, but we never know the qualitative properties of any compound thing in this way.
Okay.
And he thinks that this asymmetry gives us a reason to doubt that we ourselves are compound entities.
Yeah.
And he acknowledges that this might not prove that we are simple, but at the very least, it establishes, um, you know, that it's possible that we might be.
Okay, so through this very this very meticulous examination of our pre-reflective intuitions about ourselves and the application of these really rigorous metaphysical arguments, Chisholm arrives at this perspective on persons as potentially simple, enduring substances
Yeah,
that are distinct from their constantly changing physical bodies.
that's right.
And that's a pretty significant departure from purely materialist views.
It is, and it really, I think, it exemplifies his characteristic approach to these really deep philosophical questions, which is to start with these common sense observations and then to employ these very precise logical tools to really challenge the very foundations of our traditional metaphysical categories.
Well, this has been an incredibly insightful look into the interconnected philosophical world of Roderick Chisholm. We've looked at his meticulous method, his foundationalist but still in some ways coherentist epistemology with its detailed principles and internalist commitments, and then his really compelling arguments concerning the metaphysics of persons, which offer this really powerful challenge to materialism and suggest this more fundamental, potentially simple nature of the self.
And as we said at the beginning, this is really just a selective deep dive. Chisholm's philosophical system is remarkably extensive and it's deeply interconnected. And he was engaged with these really fundamental philosophical questions throughout his long and very intellectually rich career.
So, for you, our listener, our philosophically minded listener, I want to leave you with a couple of questions. How does Chisholm's, very rigorous approach to definitions and the construction of these almost axiomatic systems, how does that inform your own philosophical investigations? Does his really staunch defense of epistemological internalism resonate with your understanding of knowledge and justification? And what implications might his arguments about personal identity have for contemporary debates in philosophy of mind? Especially as they relate to consciousness and persistence.
Yeah, these are the sorts of enduring questions that Chisholm's work continues to provoke and illuminate for philosophers today. We encourage you to delve further into his primary texts and the substantial body of secondary literature that's developed around his ideas, and hopefully this deep dive has provided a good starting point for your own further explorations in this really rich and rewarding philosophical landscape.
Thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
We'll see you next time.
See you then.